Hey you, and welcome. My name is Mike, and in this old video, we are setting sail. In the summer of 1816, roughly 150 of the people who survived the shipwreck of the Medusa, they were kind of put aboard this little raft. And here's a little sneak preview. It kind of looked like this. I drew that. So, applause. 147 people were on that. Less than 2 weeks later, only 15 of those 147 people would still be alive. So yeah, that's the story we're talking about today. Now let's start talking about it. Let's give it a go. So in the June of 1816, 4 ships left France as part of a convoy, and they were sailing to Senegal. The Medusa was a fine ship. In my professional opinion, it was pretty good. It was a well-renowned ship. It was good. It was modern. It was up to date. It was a ship. Like, it's great. I don't know what else to tell you. Given command of the Medusa was a guy named, and I actually have to read this because his name is crazy, Hugh Duroy de Chaumaret. Hugh was an interesting guy. Probably not someone who should have been given command of a ship like this at all, mainly because he hadn't actually sailed in 25 years by the time 1816 rolled around to see. He was given command of the Medusa because essentially he was connected to the newly restored monarchy. He was a good old boy, and so he had friends, and they were like, here you go. Last time he had sailed was during the American Revolution on a French ship in the Americas at that time. He'd sailed during then. Then during the French Revolution, which followed swiftly afterwards, he fled to England lest he, be guillotined and killed. Then he came back to France when the monarchy was restored, and essentially he kind of just lied his way into being command of this ship. And they were like, all right, here you go. And he said, Missy. So he was given command of the Medusa, which was to be part of this expedition. These 4 ships, they were going to travel from France to Senegal, to the port of Saint Louis in Senegal, as France was taking back control of the colony there. And so let's begin the voyage, which began on June 17th, 1816. The Medusa, newly repainted black and white, it had 30 of its cannons removed, so it could make way for more provisions and more soldiers and supplies it was taking to the colony of Senegal. The French, they were kind of eager little beavers to get in there. They were giving grants to French people to move to Senegal, and they were given loads of land. On board, as Captain Hugh, obviously, who was in command of the whole thing, there was also the new governor of Senegal who was going there. Governor Schmaltz was his name, and there was a couple of other bigwigs on board. 4 ships were heading out of this convoy. The Medusa, the Loire, the Argus, and the Echo. The Medusa being the flagship. On board the Medusa were approximately 400 people, 3/4 of those soldiers or sailors, the rest passengers, explorers, families, engineers, naturalists, tradespeople, administrators. Things were in good shape, though, once it headed out. The crew were getting on really well together. They were working really well all together. One incident, though, they did have was a 15-year-old sailor went overboard, and they failed to rescue him. In fact, Captain Hugh would come under a lot of criticism for that because they thought he acted very, very slowly before the boy went down to Davy Jones' locker. Yes, the Captain Hugh generally wasn't well regarded by the crew. They thought him inadequate, inept, and arrogant. All of which were true. I mean, he hadn't sailed for 25 years. He knew he shouldn't have been command of this and didn't have a clue what he was doing, but he was hiding it all with a little bit of a gold arrogance. So anytime somebody on the Medusa tried to challenge him, he would be like, listen here, pal, etc., etc. They continued to sail south past Spain and Portugal, reaching the islands of Tenerife. But the convoy became split up. Some of the other ships in the convoy, they couldn't keep up with the Medusa. And now a convoy kind of splitting up, it's not unusual. It's actually fairly common. They're like, we all know where we're going. We'll see at some point, along the way. We might lose you for a few days, but we'll get you a spyglass and, there you is, scrat. But the Medusa's navigational charts were off. They were not exactly heading in the right direction, and 1 degree can be catastrophic. It can take you way away from where you need to be. And other officers and crew on the Medusa started to realize this, that they were getting closer and closer. Like, they're supposed to go around the coast of Africa, but they were getting closer and closer to Africa itself. So they knew this was going on, but Hugh and his navigator was a little crony of his. Boy, oh boy, you better not criticize them or else. This truly is a story, one that is all too common of, just incompetence and arrogance, which are always a great mix, leading to horrific circumstances for everybody involved. And so, as they approached Senegal, other officers knew they were way off course, and dangerously so. The Arguin Bank was well known at this point. It's a shallow water area, full of sandbanks and whatnot. Great for fishing, terrible for big hefty ships that need a lot of depth, so they don't run aground. And officers could see they were getting close to the bank. Kelp and seaweed were becoming more visible. The water, it changed color from blue to green. They could see more and more fish. They sailed, and the water was constantly getting shallower and shallower until Hugh finally said, okay, change direction, quarter starboard, something, whatever. By that time, though, it was too little and it was too late. And on July 2nd, there was a scraping sound, there was a lurching, there was a jolting, and the Medusa ran into a sandbank and became stuck. 50 kilometers, 30 miles off the coast of Mauritania, just north of Senegal. It had become lodged on these sandbanks that were just underneath the water. Now, when it initially happened, obviously it was shocking, everybody was kind of freaking out, but they didn't realize they were as screwed as they actually were. The captain, Hugh, by the way, he immediately, when this happened and he realized, oh, this is my fault, he immediately just went pale, he went quiet, and he became pretty much completely useless for kind of the rest of this story, actually. They checked how deep the water was below the Medusa. It was 5 meters, which is about 16 feet. This was at high tide. The water was only going to get shallower and shallower. They could not move the ship. Some now suggested, how about we start throwing stuff overboard? How about we start getting rid of some of the cannons and some of the provisions and supplies we were taking to the colony? And they were immediately said, no. We would rather lose everything than lose some of the supplies we're bringing to the colony. Captain Hugh, he was more or less told, be quiet and stand in the corner, while Governor Schmaltz, he took charge of this entire situation. So, moving the ship initially seemed impossible. Throwing stuff overboard to try and lighten the load, so the ship might be able to kind of slip off the sandbank, that was poo-pooed. That idea was poo-pooed. The next idea, alright, how about we get everybody off the Medusa? They did have a couple of longboats, but they were, for the amount of people who were on board, nowhere near enough. It would have taken days to ferry everybody on the ship to land, which was again like 30 miles away. It would have taken days to do it all. And they were worried that, well, for start, land is desert out there, and they were worried about attacks and enslavement by the Moors who lived there at the time. Or their next thing was, how about we just send one of these smaller little longboats and we sail to Saint Louis, and then we just wait and we get help. But the problem with that was that they were worried the Medusa could start breaking apart at any time, and then they would really be screwed. Or, how about this? They could create a giant raft capable of carrying a lot of people and supplies and provisions, and then with those smaller boats, they tow the raft to land. And then everybody gets off, and then they just walk from there to Senegal. But at least they get everybody off at the same time, so there's no kind of, 5 boats towed, they'd be there, at least they'd all be together. That was Governor Schmaltz's idea. Guess which idea they went with? And so, construction of the raft began, which they called the machine. Or, as they say in French, la machine! See, the reason they wanted to get out of there as soon as possible was that the seas were getting rougher and rougher, the wind was constantly picking up, and they were waiting for late summer storms, so they were really thinking things are going to get no bomb. So, carpenters, they got to work. They used booms, and they used masts, they used planks, they held it all together with wood, they took apart basically as much as they could to make this big raft. It was as shite as you think it might be. So, as you can see, this is what it would have looked like, and it kind of looks like, there was planks, and it was all tied together with rope, and as you can see, it kind of looks like a big waffle. Now, you can probably tell, like, understand what the problem with setting it a big waffle out to the open ocean would be. And your problem right there is that it will get wet. It won't be delicious and crispy anymore. There was a railing about 40 centimeters high, about 1 foot high, around the entire thing, so you won't fall off. It's a good whole foot high. And a lot of it was actually underwater already. So it looked like this, or it looked like this. I prefer my one though, because this one was made with love. So you have a recipe for disaster already, and the raft hasn't even set out yet. It'll get worse. So it would be towed to the coast by 5 boats. So that's kind of what it would have looked like, something like that. That's not poop, they're actually boats. So take them to land, then walk over. And people were either assigned to the boats or to the raft itself. This would eventually fit 147 people on this, while the rest would go on these long boats. All the important people, the governor, his family, captains, officers, they all were on the boats. They made damn sure they were not going to be on the raft. Not their cup of tea being on board this thing, which is about as good as it looks. As you can see, surrounded by water and by sharks. And so on July 5th, the evacuation order was given. When they were evacuating and people started boarding the raft, by the time 40 men were aboard, it had already sank 2 feet into the water. Parts of it were pretty heavily underwater before a third of the people were even aboard the goddamn thing. Provisions were thrown off the raft to try and lighten the load so it would be able to hold these people without sinking entirely. So then by the end of it, they would have 6 tubs of wine, they are French, so 6 tubs of wine, 2 tubs of water, and a bag of soggy seawater-soaked biscuits. That was all for 147 people. So, sacre bleu! And another 100 people still had to get on board the raft that was already sinking because it was shite. Most of the people who actually ended up getting on the raft were forced to at musket point. All the officers said, yeah, I'm not setting foot on that. In fact, one of the lieutenants who was supposed to be in charge of the raft, he even said it was the plan for him to go onto the raft and he'll take care of them all. He said, no, I'm not fucking setting foot on that thing. 17 people stayed back on the Medusa rather than get on board this raft. So they set out, the raft pulled by 4 boats. Actually, one turned out wasn't big enough to actually do anything. And they were headed towards land. But I mean, yeah, okay, they can make it, right? It's not too far. Things will be très bon. Then shit happened because the current was pulling the raft out to sea. The raft was much bigger than the boats that were towing it. So the raft was being pulled by the current away from land, and the raft was pulling the towboats with it away from land. So no bon over here at all. Je n'ai pas no bon. And so the order was given. Cut the ropes. Now some protested. They said don't cut them. But the governor gave the order, and what the governor says, that gets done. Au revoir. And so with hatchets, the ropes were cut. The boats were now free to make their way to dry land, while the raft was drifting further and further away from the towboats, away from land, the current just dragging it slowly out to sea, while the 147 people aboard were screaming not to be abandoned. Land was nowhere in sight, and they had absolutely no way to steer the thing. So this is when the fun begins. Now the raft was shite. As I said, much of it was underwater. A lot of people who were on the raft, they were underwater up to their waists, trying to just touch the bottom of the raft itself with their feet. There was waves constantly knocking against people, saltwater spray. Some people had to tie ropes around themselves lest they be dragged off by the water that was simply washing over the top of the raft. The hot African sun was beating down, and there ain't no shade. There was no shade or cover on the raft either. That was just out in the middle of the ocean. A guy named Henry Sauvigny, he was the ship's surgeon, and he was the one to take command. He took over and tried to start, okay, this is what we need to do. There wasn't really much he could do. He supervised the construction of a small sail, and he was who kind of gave out the first meal. The first and only meal that was not human, which they would ever get, which was soggy, seawater-soaked biscuits dipped in wine. After that, the food was gone. They didn't have charts. They didn't pack a compass. One guy on board the raft just so did happen to have a compass, but when he took it out of his pocket, he dropped it, and it fell between the planks of the raft and down into the water below. And madness didn't take long to set in for these people. Some people, they they just jumped off the raft. They simply just floated off, letting the sea take them, thinking that it'd be better to go this way than to try and survive on the raft and live out agonizing days here waiting to die. People, of course, who would be floating off, or who walked off or jumped off the raft, were promptly eaten by sharks that were circling the raft too. The raft, as I said, not well built, so the planks that were held together rope, they began to separate, which was the ground for them. People would get their limbs trapped in the planks below, or their waists, or whatever, either dragging you down and then drowning you under the water, or breaking limbs and breaking legs and breaking anything that got caught between them. And so darkness slowly began to fall. Pitch black darkness, floating in the water. Most people barely able to touch the bottom of the raft, with their feet floating in the water, just trying to cling tightly to one another as waves would keep crashing in against them as the weather got worse and worse. The first night, 20 people died. People began to lose their minds, to hallucinate, to cry out in fear, and then the weather became stormy, with these waves crashing against the raft. The wind was picking up, swells would wash over and drag people off the raft, dragging them to their doom where they would never be seen again. People were constantly trying to get to the middle of the raft, where it was safest and where it was highest above the water, which meant getting there any way you can, dragging people out of your way. There's people crushed and people trampled to death. They'd be reefing people out of the way, who then would be washed away by a wave that would just come over and wash people off the raft. One group of soldiers, they went crazy. They stole one of the barrels of wine, which had now mixed with salt water, and they drank it all, and they got drunk like in 2 seconds. They were already losing their minds, and so they took out some of their weapons and they started breaking the raft apart with hatchets and with swords and killing anybody who approached them. They grabbed their own officer, who they evidently had some kind of problem with, dragged him to them and gouged his eyes out. They then had to be killed by the others, and there was like even these miniature battles aboard this big huge raft with, you know, these soldiers who'd gone insane, and then these other people who were trying to keep things in order, and then they were killing each other and stabbing, and people were throwing each other overboard to get to safety. Soon the raft was covered with dead and wet bodies. By the third day, another 60 people had died. The raft had only been out for 3 days now, and over half the people who had been on it were dead. And only 1 cask of wine remained for the 70 remaining people. This is literally hell aboard this raft. Some then, out of hunger, began eating leather pouches. One tried to eat his own shit, but he couldn't go through with it. And of course everything was covered in salt water, which just made their hunger and their thirst more insatiable and insane. And so, with dead bodies littering the raft, you can kind of see where this is going. You gotta wonder how far you'd be pushed to become a cannibal. Pretty far, I guess. I think this qualifies. The custom of the sea is, as it's called, you know, it's basically sailors' way of saying if you're trapped out on the sea, cannibalism, you get a pass for cannibalism in that situation. And if no bodies are available, well, straws would be drawn, and, well, you know, in this case, they had a lot of bodies already. So on the 3rd day at water, people began hacking up the bodies and just going for them. They whipped out knives, they whipped out hatchets, they started slicing meat off these bodies, which littered the raft, slicing the meat off their shoulders or their legs, and just chowing down, munching in raw. Bon appetit! All the while the sea ravaged around them, and you know, they tried and sleep standing up, because you obviously couldn't even, most of them were up to water in their waists, so you couldn't exactly lie down. They were huddled together, and then night would fall. The next morning, there would be more bodies. By the 4th day, everybody was eating the dead, and after another night where another group of soldiers went insane and started murdering others on the raft, pretty soon there was only 30 people left. Everyone was wounded or extremely ill at this point, and so tough decisions had to be made. Even tougher than the human meat they were eating. You can imagine what those were, right? Not everybody is gonna survive this. We need to ration out the food we have, and a lot of people are dead, dying, wounded, fatally wounded. What's the point in giving them food if they're gonna be dead in a couple of hours? It's a bit of a waste. The closest to death were put on half rations, which at this point was pretty much no rations at all, like maybe half a gulp of wine and a chomp of human for your day rations. But then Sauvigny and some of the other people, they began to realize even that's not going to be enough if the bulk of people are going to make it. More needed to be done to survive. A survival at this point was probably an extra few days. So they did it. Four soldiers went up 2 people grabbed each limb. 1 and 2 and one of the first people they threw off board was the only woman. Her husband. He went overboard. The leader of Raft, Henry Savnier, by the way, he would survive the raft, and he would later write a book about his ordeal, and he said this was the hardest part of trying to live on the raft. But this is what he had to say about it. Readers who shudder at the cry of outraged humanity recollect, at least, that it was other men, fellow countrymen and comrades, who had placed us in this abominable situation. What we did was horrific, but you should really blame those who put us in this situation. I mean, those rich people, they kind of spiritually were the ones who actually threw them overboard. Then there was 15 people left on this raft, which was barely hanging together. Half of it was just floating off and barely attached by ropes that were rotting, wood that was rotting. The remaining people threw all the weapons overboard so they wouldn't be able to kill each other, because they all started going insanely paranoid. And then they set about doing absolutely nothing, waiting for the inevitable, just lying there on the raft under the hot baking sun. They drank their own pee to survive. They would pee in their little canteen and put it in pools of seawater to cool it down. Glug glug. They said other people's pee tasted differently. There you go. Sharks, though, were still circling the raft, and everything that was painful was extremely painful. The sun was constantly beating down, so they would submerge themselves in water to try and cool their bodies down. But then a group, a whole load of Portuguese man-of-war jellyfish would wash on board, stinging the shite out of them. But I can imagine their pain was just so unbearable, they probably didn't even notice. They were there for a week, lying on the raft with no energy, just lying there waiting to die, being burnt to the crisp, when early on the morning of July 17th, they finally saw sail. It was the Argus, one of the ships that had set out with the convoy in the first place. To put it connily, they looked like shit when these 15 people were rescued. They were burnt all over, emaciated, and they were insane. Some of the survivors tried to immediately jump overboard back into the water when they were saved. And of the 15 people they did save, 5 would pass away within a couple of days. The Argus had lost sight of the Medusa when it had ran aground. It had been searching the area for like 2 weeks before it just so happened to stumble across the raft. They were then taken to St. Louis and given food, gently given food, and to tell their story of the 147 people who set out. 15 survived. Of those 15, only 10 survived. The rest had been eaten by humans or sharks, or murdered, or thrown overboard, or whatever. And Captain Hugh would get the blame for the entire ordeal. His incompetence was essentially the reason this had all happened, but of course, being the good old boy that he was, he just got a little slap on the wrist for it. He was court-martialed, but he only got 3 years in jail, in prison for it. I mean, he could have been executed for what had happened. Governor Schmaltz, he escaped all blame. He would stay in Senegal, do 4 years as governor. Even though it was his idea to build the raft and then cut the ropes, he still kind of scot-free. The Medusa was found. It was pretty broken open though by the time it was found. Of the 17 men who stayed with the Medusa, only 3 of them were still alive. 1 had just died the morning they were about to be rescued, and a lot of the others, they tried to swim to land, but they were never seen again. Of course though, when a ship came across the Medusa, I was like, yippee! They weren't there to look for any survivors. They were there for all the provisions it still had, of course. This entire incident was immortalized by French painter Theodore Géricault. He later read the story of the tragedy and became transfixed by it. He met with survivors, he interviewed them, and he even procured body parts from a nearby insane asylum, including a severed head, because he wanted to get the bodies in the painting just right. And Géricault actually painted it while being advised by some of these survivors. One even posed for the painting to make it as accurate as possible. The raft of the Medusa hangs in the Louvre today, showing the moment when the survivors spotted the Argus in the distance. The whole incident was very embarrassing for the French, of course, who had only recently just restored their own monarchy, and then through the incompetence of one of their captains, well, you had cannibalism and this whole rigmarole. Didn't look good for them. In fact, the British, who were handing over the colony to the French, treated the survivors of the Medusa way better than the French did. They gave them better food and they brought them back to France. I think the French government probably would have been just much more happy if nobody had survived, and nobody had lived to tell the tale. And so ends the story of the Medusa and the wreck and the raft and the whole kind of kit and caboodle. A horror of survival for sure, when it's not really told much, or at least I knew very little of it, so I hope we learned something new today, kids. But definitely one thing I learned is how little it takes for absolute savagery to break out. Within 2 days, they were killing each other. Within 3, they were eating each other. Doesn't take much, just one small push for you to go overboard and then start doing things that are at one point unimaginable for you. But you know, you gotta do what you gotta do. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you being here, watching this whole video. It means so much to me as always. I hope you found it interesting. Little piece of dark history, which, you know, I love to tell. I love history and I love horror, so it's great to mix them like in these kind of stories. So yeah, listen, here, check out the Patreon for Patreon exclusive videos and early access to all videos. I'm on Twitter and Instagram. I'm not on Telegram, so if you ever get any comments claiming to be me or Mike O or that chapter in YouTube videos or anywhere, if you ever get any comments saying, let's talk about this on Telegram or you've won a competition, it is not me. If I'm not on Telegram, full stop. And if I am ever having a competition or anything like that, you will hear the words from my very own mouth. There's about 1 million bots on YouTube pretending to be me and other creators. I deleted, I banned loads of them, but they still keep popping up, so just beware of that. But yeah. Anyways, I'll see you in the next old video. So listen, here, I'll see you real soon in the next old video, but until then, please, as always, take care of each other, take care of yourselves, because I love you. Mike out.